thanks for the invite. I mean, my focus for today, really goes to what I look for when I go to trainings, which is, it's nice to get kind of a theoretical look or a different perspective at stuff. But I think ideally, and what I would hope for from the day, is that you actually feel like you get some ideas that perhaps not tomorrow, but maybe on Monday you say, oh, I can use that. I could do that. So that's really the kind of focus for today. Just real quickly, if people can give me a sense of who you work with and what kind of settings you work in, so maybe we can talk about that a little bit. So folks here from school systems? Okay, just kind of a quick, so I get a sense, okay. Any kind of residential settings or group homes or stuff like that? Anything here? No? Clinics, just outpatient clinics doing outpatient therapy? Okay. Youth services, bulk folks, okay. DCF folks, okay. Who am I missing? Church, okay. Okay. Community-based, yeah, okay. All right, so as we talk today, first off, it's a small enough group, feel free to ask questions. Feel free to disagree. My staff disagrees with me all the time, so I'm really used to that, so don't worry about that. And really, again, the goal here, at least in my mind, is not for me to just kind of talk at you for the next 3 hours, but really to have it be much more of a conversation. So that's what we'll start with. So first and foremost, there are some, and folks who have heard me before, there are some basic clinical assumptions that kind of make sense for, I think, to get out there. And the first, for me, is this notion of children do well if they can. People familiar with Ross Greene, he's written a few books, The Explosive Child, Treating the Explosive Child, all that. This goes back, I think, probably in 1984, 85. Ross and I actually shared a case together of sibling abuse within a family, where I was doing the evaluation of the kid who was the alleged abuser, and Ross was treating the family, and then we had a joint meeting. And that was the first time I heard him say that. He kind of sat down with the family and sort of had this phrase, children do well if they can. And again, my interpretation of this is always that there is really no kid that we work with who wakes up in the morning, looks in the mirror, and says, you know what, I just want to piss as many people off today as I possibly can. You know, like if I can get one adult absolutely beside themselves, you know how they look with their faces all scrunched up and their neck muscles bulging out wanting to strangle me? Like if I can get one adult to do that today, that's a great day. And if I could get 4 or 5 adults to do that today, boy, it doesn't get any better than that. That's like Christmas, you know? It's like, that's the best thing. I don't think that any of our kids actually kind of have that conversation with themselves. However, there are numerous times when I will do a case consult or sit down with parents or sit down with teachers or sit down with staff at our place, and you'll hear comments like, you know what this kid likes? Like he comes into my classroom or he comes in, you know, to the house and everyone else is just settling in and this kid just loves to push everyone's buttons. Like he just loves to needle. He just loves to provoke. And he's not there 5 minutes and the place is in an uproar. He just sits back and laughs. He just loves to stir things up. Or, you know, you're talking to a foster parent. It's like all the other kids come in after school and they settle down. She walks in and she's not there 2 minutes and the place is chaos because she just loves, she can't stand it when it's calm. She loves to kind of get things going. I actually don't think any kid we work with loves that. I actually think the kids that we work with want what I would argue all kids want. And I think that comes down to three basic things. I think they want to be cared for by the adults in their environment. I think they want to be accepted by at least some portion of their peer group. And I think they want to be competent at the stuff that they do during the course of the day, whether that is school or music or dance or video games or sports or whatever it is. We all have a need to feel competent, to feel like we're good at something. Now, do we work with kids who each and every day get at least one adult absolutely beside themselves with them? Yes. And if you kind of work with the guys that I work with, they get 4 or 5 adults absolutely beside themselves with them every day. But just because it happens all the time doesn't mean that's what they want. I think when it happens all the time, what we're seeing is they haven't got a clue as to how to get those 3 needs met. How do you get adults to actually pay attention to you and care about you? How do you get your peers to accept you and like you? And how do you become competent at the stuff that you do during the course of the day? And I would argue that that basically defines our job. Regardless of what your role is, the job becomes, how do we identify the obstacle getting in this kid's way of getting those 3 basic needs met? And then how do you either move those obstacles out of the way or give the kid the skills to get over, under, and around those obstacles to meet those 3 needs? And I would also argue that there's a corollary to this, and that is parents do well if they can. I don't think any parent wakes up in the morning and says, I want to create as many DSM-5 diagnoses for my child as I possibly can. You know, those nice people at the community center, you know, I heard they're cutting back funds. You know, we want to make sure that they're employed. I've got 4 kids. If I make them crazy as possible, I can kind of keep at least 8 people, you know, employed for the next 10 years. I don't think parents think that way. Now, I will tell you that I have worked with parents who sometimes it looks like that's what they're trying to do, is make their kids as crazy as possible. I don't think that's their goal. And so when you see the fact that when we talk to parents about, well, you need to be structured and you need to provide supervision, you know, and you need to be kind of, you know, giving support to your kids and you need to be emotionally available, and we see that they struggle to do that, I don't think it's because they say, oh, that stuff doesn't matter. I don't care about that. I think it's they don't have a clue as to how to get there. And oftentimes they don't have that clue because they have not experienced that themselves. They haven't experienced living in a structured environment. They haven't experienced having regular supports. They don't know kind of what level of supervision fits for what age of kids. A lot of parents that we work with, the kid like hits literally 10 or 11 years old and they throw up their hands and they say, I can't do anything with this kid anymore. They do whatever they want to do, and they don't have that sense that they can be competent at being parents. So essentially, you know, these kind of 2 clinical assumptions kind of work from the prospect of no one likes to be dysfunctional. No one likes to be dysregulated. People do not like living in chaos. But they also have to see that there's a clear way that they can do it differently. One of the real difficulties I find working with kids in the system is, and particularly with kids who are already involved with DCF and DYS and those kind of agencies, is the fact that when you look at the treatment plans for some of these families, they're like 4 pages, 5 pages long. Like and literally all the things on those 5 pages can be legitimate issues. However, think about your jobs. If I came to you today and said, you know, you're really good at this, I'm going to give you 5 more cases because you're really good at it. I'm going to give you 4 more tasks to do because you're really good at this. You would not sit there and say, thanks, I really appreciate that kind of, you know, support from you. You'd sit there and go, I barely have time to do the stuff that's already on my plate. I'm not going to have time to do this. We have families that part of the reason why they're sitting with us, they're already overwhelmed. they're already feeling like they can't manage what's on their plate. And then we come in and we say, oh, and you have to get your kid to the therapy appointment once a week, and then you have to get to the family therapy appointment once a week. Then you have to get to the parenting skills class. Oh, and we want this kid involved in those after-school activities, so you have to make sure that you're available for that. And then it becomes like, I don't know how I'm going to manage that. We think of all those things as those are good things, like you would want to do this. But we've also just added a ton of stuff onto these people's plates, and they're already feeling like they can't do what's there already. So instead of the 4-page treatment plan, we have to think of what are the top 2? What are the 1 or 2 things that we need to address first? And perhaps the hardest part is, how do we get the rest of the system to agree with that? Because oftentimes what happens is, okay, I'm the kid's therapist, I have an agenda, but the kid's involved in DCF and they have a slightly different agenda, and then the school has a slightly different agenda, and the probation officer has a slightly different agenda. And now what I think is I'm only making 1 or 2 requests, but everybody's making 1 or 2 requests. And now it feels like, so who am I supposed to listen to? Whose comes first? And typically what happens is I pick the ones that are either easiest for me, or where I feel I'm going to get the least amount of pushback, or that maybe people won't kind of hold me accountable for those. So that's where I'm going to tend to go to, as opposed to all of the people working with this family saying, no, these are the top 1 and 2 that we've decided on systemically, and therefore we can approach the family with, these are the priorities, this is what comes first, and we're all on board with that. So that's just part of the process for handling the system. Trauma in childhood has a neurodevelopmental impact. We'll talk a good deal about that. The kids' own trauma experiences and their current behavior are linked. Part of this comes from my work with going back into the 80s of working with kids with sexual behavior problems. Back at that point, we would literally not let kids talk about their own trauma histories, because we thought if you talked about your own trauma history, you were making excuses for the behavior that you engaged in, and we're supposed to hold you accountable for the behavior you engaged in, as if the 2 of those are not inextricably linked with one another. If the kid doesn't think you're willing to care about the bad stuff that's happened to them, then it's going to be really difficult for them to care about the bad stuff that maybe they've engaged in and done to other people. So, you know, the 2 of those are together. And the kid, and this is true across the board, kids have to feel like, you know, someone's going to keep them safe if you're asking them to keep other people safe. It also works for parents. Somebody's got to feed the parents if we expect the parents to feed the kids. So again, understanding that there's a link, even though the trauma that they experienced may have been when they were 2 and 3 and 4 years old, there's still a connection between that and the behaviors that they're engaged in at 14, 15, and 16. And we'll talk about the whole issue of what it means to hold somebody accountable in those situations. Development is nonlinear and transactional, which basically means A, we're dealing with children and adolescents, so they are going to screw up. They're going to make bad decisions sometimes. Everything is not just going to go on this completely upward curve all the time. There's going to be things they progress, and then they're going to drop down, and then they're going to hopefully come back up again. So it's nonlinear, but more important, it's transactional. It's about experiences and relationships. We get caught up sometime in this notion of, you know, we have to come up with these clever interventions or activities or stuff for kids to do, and all of that is helpful. But the research on change in treatment is pretty clear. The single biggest element is the relationship that the person has with the folks providing the treatment. It's really about the relationship. Like all the other stuff, kind of coming up with the clever interventions and what theoretical approach you take and all that, it's not like that's completely unimportant, but the research would say that's about 15% of what promotes change, where the relational piece is over 50% of what promotes change. I often think about, this goes back now to like 1980 or 81. I was part of a group that did a study with kids who had been in the Massachusetts DYS system, the kids who had been in juvenile lockup, the secure treatment centers. And what we did is we looked at kids after they got out of secure treatment to talk to them about, for the kids who did well, what made a difference? What turned things around for you? What seemed to be the factors that made it better? And literally not one of those kids, who actually weren't kids by then, they were in their 20s, not one person said, you know, my therapist came up with a great behavior management program and that turned my life around from it. Like not a single person said that. Or those terms of probation, that was like a cathartic experience for me. I never knew there were consequences for my behavior before. Not one kid said that. What they said was, I had an aunt, I had a grandmother, I had a coach, I had a teacher, I had a therapist, I had a social worker, I had a minister. I had someone who hung in there with me. I had someone that even when I was acting like a complete jerk, they still showed up. I had somebody that even when I didn't want to listen to a word that they said to me, still told me what I needed to hear. Literally, every kid who had done well, when you talked to them, they pointed to a relationship. Maybe it was, you know, I met this girl and she said if I kept smoking weed and drinking and like didn't get a job, they were leaving. I didn't want to lose that relationship. So ultimately, that's going to be the engine that drives the train. Probably somewhere up here is a slide that says that one of the take-home messages for today is that kids have to think that you care before they care what you think. And that is really going to be ultimately, if kids feel like you're invested in them, that you care about them, doesn't mean you have to save them. Doesn't mean you have to take them home to live with you. They just have to feel like it matters to you. And so ultimately that's a piece in it. These established patterns are transformed by new experiences, but new experiences are shaped by your past. The kids who come to us, because most frequently they have histories of trauma, their experience is shaped by those histories of trauma, and that's the lens that they view everything else in. So if I've never been able to trust adults in my life because they've always made decisions or done things that hurt me, just because you say you're a nice person and you're not going to do that, I may not be buying that. One of the things that comes up frequently in our program is I'll hear staff say to kids, you know, if you treat people respectfully, they'll treat you respectfully. And the kid looks at them and goes, where'd you grow up? You know, because that ain't what happened in my house. You know, I was always respectful to my dad. Didn't stop him from beating the crap out of me when he was drinking and came home. You know, I got straight A's in school. Didn't stop my uncle from sexually abusing me. So it doesn't mean that that statement is wrong. It means the kids have to have an experience of that to believe that it's true. Just you saying it is not going to be enough. They actually have to have experience of feeling competent, of feeling safe, of feeling respected, of feeling cared for, of feeling nurtured before they say, oh, maybe this is different. Maybe not everybody's like that. Maybe I don't fail at everything. There's a physiological response to trauma. We often talk about, and it'll be up there in terms of one of the impacts of trauma, is this notion of hypervigilance. And we tend to think about hypervigilance as an emotional state, where kids are anxious, where they're always on guard, they're kind of always watching their back. I would really encourage people to think about hypervigilance as hyperarousal, as a physiological state. There are certain things that go on with your body when you're in a hypervigilant state. Your heart rate goes up. Your large muscle groups get activated, your palms sweat a little bit, and your brain changes the way it processes information. It narrows what it pays attention to, because it's basically paying attention to threat and safety. Those are the only two things. And there's a really, oops, somewhere along here, right here. This is actually information, comes from a guy named Bruce Perry, research project he did a number of years ago. And what you're looking here is the resting heart rates from 580 kids who came into a trauma clinic down in Texas. What you see in the diamonds are the boys in the study. What you see in the squares are the girls in the study. And what you see on the little yellow dotted, the little yellow triangles with the dotted line there, normal expected pediatric heart rate for kids at those ages. So one of the things that oftentimes gets said about these kids is, hey, this kid will go from 0 to 60 like this. Seems to be fine, everything's going, no outward signs, and then something happens and they just snap. And the next thing you know, they're flipping over the tables, they're dysregulated, they're completely going off. I would argue that that's not true. And the reason why it's not true is because these kids are not starting the day at 0. You look at these kids, they're starting the day at 55. I want you to just look at the beats per minute here. This is 110 beats a minute, okay? For those of you who are wearing Fitbits or Apple Watches, for those of you who kind of go to the gym on a regular basis or kind of pay attention to this stuff, do a little experiment for yourself. See what it takes you to get to 110 beats a minute. Get on a treadmill. Just kind of walk along, see how long it takes you to get there. I will guarantee you, you may not kind of be at a full sprint to get to 110 beats a minute, but you're also not going to be at a casual walk. It's a pretty activated state to be at 110 beats a minute. And that's where these kids are waking up in the morning. Now, so you're seeing these kids, they're like 2 standard deviations above the normal expected pediatric heart rate. Now, the other thing you see here is right around the age of puberty, the girls in the study start falling below the normal expected pediatric heart rate. And since this is a largely female audience, you're probably saying to yourself, yes, just one more example of how women handle stress far better than men do. That's not actually the case. What Perry would argue is that there's 2 ways that your body deals with the persistent experience of stress. One is to externalize, one is to dissociate. He is not arguing that only males externalize and only females dissociate. In fact, any of you who work with particularly middle school and adolescent females know that they externalize quite well in a whole variety of circumstances. And those, certainly I even look at our program and look at a large number of kids who manage their stress by dissociating, by just kind of spacing out. Oftentimes, particularly for those of you who work in schools, these are the kids who will just say, I'm tired a lot, and put their heads down on their desk and just kind of try to shut everything else down. These kids tend to get the most attention because when you're externalizing, you're now intruding on other people's comfort zone oftentimes. So they get a lot more attention, but I would argue that both of these are equally problematic. The kids at the top will get more services because they're going to be more obvious. The kids who are dissociating oftentimes don't even come to our attention until they kind of break from that more dissociative path, and then they start doing things like trying to kill themselves or presenting as if they're psychotic or being so distant that now they're failing in school and kind of persistently struggling. Yes?
So I'm noticing that the younger kids are more above the norm heart rate, so younger kids may be more often externalized than dissociated.
Right, and part of that is going to come from your environment and how you get socialized also. So the more immediate response for kids is to do that more externalized piece. But part of it then comes from, is anybody responding when I'm in this state? And so if no one is responding to that, eventually kids just kind of, some kids will just shut it down. Some kids will keep up in the ante to say, okay, what's it going to take till you do respond? But some kids will just sit there and say, essentially, that's not working. That's not keeping me safer. I'm consistently being overwhelmed all the time. And that's when you kind of move to, so the best way to manage the stress is just not to engage with the rest of this process. The other thing about this is this also puts you at risk for greater victimization. Because one of the things that begins to happen is that, and this is true for both sides, if you are a victim of trauma, you now become at 40% greater risk to become re-victimized. And one of the things that will put you in that state is you're no longer reading those internal cues. We talked about your heart rate goes up and your muscles, your large muscle groups get engaged and your palms start sweating. But if you're there all the time, then one of the things that happens is those cues no longer differentiate for you the truly threatening situations from the mildly annoying situations from the totally safe situations. So your judgment about, okay, what's safe and what's not safe gets skewed. And you end up putting yourself oftentimes in really unsafe situations, or sometimes you end up running away from totally safe situations and to engage in a lot of other stuff. So we see kids, we put them in foster care and they run away from foster care and they go back to like really threatening environments, or they're just out on the street, or they're doing a whole bunch of stuff that actually is far more dangerous than where they're coming from. And then the last part of this is it's impossible to discuss trauma in kids without looking at the quality of parental attachment. There are really two pieces to this. One is just about resiliency. If you look at the resiliency literature, it will tell you that the main factor in kids being resilient, the number one thing, and it doesn't matter which study you look at, is the presence of a consistent, supportive, emotionally available adult in a child's life. That is the single biggest factor in kids being resilient in the face of trauma. To go back just a second to that notion of treatment plans. So if every study is telling us this is the single biggest factor in kids being resilient to trauma, and we're all supposed to be doing evidence-based practice, one would think that at the top of our treatment plan would be, how do we facilitate a consistent, supportive adult relationship for this kid? Not only isn't it typically at the top of the treatment plan, very frequently it's not on the treatment plan at all. While we talk about attachment, oftentimes in terms of diagnoses, oftentimes in terms of kids' struggles with relationships, we tend not to be attachment-based systems. We tend to be behavior management-based systems. And therefore, what tends to get focused on from the kids' treatment is, how do we manage your behavior? If you're running away, how do we stop you from running away? If you're being aggressive, how do we stop you from being aggressive? And that's how we measure treatment progress. We'll talk about this a little bit more in depth as we go on, but I would argue that systemically, one of the things we have to do is we have to stop measuring progress by the absence of bad. I would argue that our goal is to help kids kind of get on with their lives in a safe, kind of productive, competent way. It is not to just have them stop bad stuff. I will typically say to folks, if I asked you, what are your goals, for those of you who have your own children, what are your goals for your children? You would probably not sit there and say, well, I hope my child doesn't become a serial rapist. I hope my child doesn't become a drug addict. I hope my child doesn't rob the local convenience store at gunpoint. I hope my child doesn't get pregnant when they're 12. We hope our kids don't do any of those things. But when you talk about goals for your own kids, it tends to be more like, I hope they're safe. I hope they're happy. I hope they're successful. I hope they fall in love. I hope they find something in their life that they're passionate about. I hope they make friends. You know, I mean, that's the stuff that we talk about for our own children. And I always wonder if those are the goals we have for our own kids, why aren't those the same goals that we have for the kids that we work with? I think we have to stop measuring progress by the absence of them doing bad things. Yeah, I mean, we could take a kid who, say, is sexually acting out, and we could forget about doing therapy. We'll just get them their own apartment. We'll sort of, you know, slide some food to them under the door, and they'll never commit another sexual offense. They'll never assault anybody. They'll never rob a bank. They won't do bad stuff anymore. If we lock the door, they can't run away. Is that really what we're looking for? What we're really hoping is as the kid gets competent, they'll not find the need to have to run away or try to kill themselves or sexually assault people, because they're able to form relationships and they're able to manage conflict and they're able to regulate themselves. And I think that's where what our treatment plan should be, not, you know, stop trying to cut yourself, stop assaulting people, stop running away. I mean, we want them, again, to stop doing all those things, just like we want our kids not to do those things. But those aren't our goals for our kids, and I think we have to be clear about what it is we're trying to achieve when we're talking about kids making progress in treatment. The other thing about this is, just from a kind of straight case management or case formulation type of view, and folks who have heard me before, I sort of say this constantly to families. When families first come in, I usually, sometime within the first 10 minutes of working with them, stop and say, I want to be really clear before we get started that I don't do car mechanics. And they look at me and go, hey, thanks for sharing, but we didn't bring our car to you anyway, so we don't really care if you know anything about car mechanics. That's that. And I say, no, let's be really clear before we start. I don't do car mechanics, because what do you do with your car mechanic? You bring your car in the morning. You say, hey, it's making this funky noise, or the brakes need work, or it needs its oil changed. And then you go home. And you come back that afternoon, and you expect your car to be fixed. I don't do car mechanics. What I am is I am the guy at Home Depot. You got a project, I got tools, okay? The first thing we're going to do is we have to agree on the project. Again, that may sound stupid, and that may seem like it's obvious with these kids, but it's not always so obvious. Those of you who have sat with these families know you can go around the room, mom, dad, grandmom, kid, siblings, and they will all give you a different version of what the problem is. You know, you ask mom, what's the problem? He's not going to school. I just wish he would go to school. I know if he doesn't go to school, he's going to drop out, and he's not going to get an education. He won't get a good job. Okay, you go to dad. What's the problem? Those kids he's hanging out with. You know, he was fine all through middle school. As soon as he got to high school, he started hanging out with these kids. If he would just stop hanging out with those kids, he'd be fine. You talk to the kid, what's the problem? If dad would just get off my ass and stop giving me grief all the time, I'd be fine. It's people pestering me constantly and getting on my case. That's what drives me crazy. And I'm sitting there with the referral going, oh, no one's going to talk about the domestic violence, huh? No one's going to talk about the drinking problem in the family. So we all have different versions of what it is we're trying to achieve here. So the first thing you have to do is actually agree upon the project. Like, what is it we're going to work on? Which means finding the overlap between, in that case, 4 different versions of what's happening here. But once we agree upon the project, I'm not going to fix this for you. You can't just drop your kid off and expect them to be fixed. You've got to be part of that process. And I would also say, and this goes on us, oftentimes we think of involving the family in therapy as having the family come in and basically reporting on the lousy stuff the kid did during the week, okay? So parents come in and they say, and, you know, he didn't go to school on Tuesday, and he got in a fight, and we found pot in his room, and, you know, and it's like, and then after they give you the list of bad things that have happened, they basically say, okay, go fix that now. Yeah, that's not engaging the family in treatment. That's just them being reporters. So we have to find those ways, and we'll talk about ways to actively engage people in treatment. But if we know that having a consistent supportive adult is the biggest factor in resiliency, then these people have to be involved. Then the question comes up, so what about the kid who's in foster care? What about the kid who's in a program? What about the kid whose parents have lost parental rights? What about those kids? Who do you involve in that case? There is a therapist I used to work with. Her name is Emily Coleman. And Emily once defined attachment as the persistent attention to daily task of caring. It's actually my favorite definition of attachment, the persistent attention to daily task of caring. So when I get asked that question, so who should be involved? My answer is, who's the adults in this kid's life who is responsible for the persistent attention to daily task of caring? Which means, who's waking this kid up in the morning? Who's feeding them? Who's clothing them? Who's involved in supervising their activities? Who is doing that stuff? Those are the first people you involve. If that's grandmom, it's grandmom. If it's an aunt and an uncle, that's who it is. If it's, in my case, the line staff at a residential program, that's who you're involving in treatment, because that's who the kid is going to make their attachments to. So it doesn't mean that down the road, it might not be a different group of people if you're trying to reunify this kid with his family, or kind of, you know, at that point, then it might be the biological parents. But at the point where you're starting, who's the adult in this kid's environment that's responsible for the persistent attention to daily task of caring? That's who you want in the room as part of the treatment. So again, we've talked about hypervigilance already. We won't go through all of these right now. There are two that I really want to kind of highlight, because we'll talk about attachment and affect dysregulation later. I want this immunity to internal cues. Again, you know, we talked about that sense of those things that go on with your body when you're in a heightened state. We oftentimes see them in kids once we get to know kids, and this is particularly true of classroom teachers or people who work with kids on a, you know, on a regular basis, like see them every afternoon in an after-school program or something like that. You can tell when the kid's having a bad day. You can tell when this, like, yeah, this is going to be a problem today, you know. And the kid doesn't have to say anything to you. You know from their tone of voice. You know from the fact that they're walking around clenching their fist, or they're hiding out in the corner, or, you know, the girl's sitting there and she's just twirling her hair constantly and stuff. You know that there's a problem. We think because we see it, and it's obvious to us, that it's obvious to the kid. It's not. I had a discussion in our program with a kid the other day. This kid, Tyler, came up, and he was really upset about this, you know, this staff had given him a consequence he didn't think was fair and stuff. And I just see him in the hallway, and he steps out, and he is like, Kevin, you can't believe what they did. And I'm like, Tyler, you're screaming at me. What do you mean I'm screaming? I'm not screaming. I don't know why you think I'm screaming. It's like, because listen to my voice, listen to your voice. So I could sit there. We could get in a struggle with him about screaming. So I just said to him, Tyler, I'm willing to listen to you. Take 2 steps back, take a breath, and then try it in just a little bit softer voice. And he's like, no, I can't. I said, I'm happy to listen. Just tone it down one thing. Like, take 2 steps back. And I took 2 steps back. That way he doesn't actually have to, okay? But then he mirrors me, so now we're 4 steps away from each other. And I said, just take a breath. So I take a breath, he takes a breath, and I say, so let's try that again. And he goes, he was, and I say, a little bit softer. Okay, he was really, you know, like, and then we had this conversation. But there's a lot of times you see adults get into the power struggles with these kids around, don't be screaming at me. I'm not screaming. What do you mean I'm screaming? That is screaming. No, it's not screaming. Then here's your consequence. If you're going to keep talking like that, you have to leave. You have to get out of the classroom. You have to leave the program. You know, and there's this notion of the kid is well aware of what he's doing. Oftentimes, these kids are not well aware of what they're doing. That remember, you look at those dissociative kids, they're cut off from their bodies oftentimes. So they're not aware that their heart rate has gone up, that they're now screaming at you, that their face is all scrunched up and they're mad, or that their fists are clenched while they're walking around. And part of that means that treatment has to be putting you back in touch with your body. Literally making you aware of how do you carry yourself? How do you walk? Do you notice that every time I bring up your dad to you, you drop your head, your shoulders slump, your face, you know, you start looking down? Because that's what happens. You notice that every time that someone even remotely says, hey, Kevin, you might want to do that differently, your voice gets louder, you jump up immediately, and you start trying to defend yourself when people are just trying to help you out here. And so helping kids be aware of that process becomes really important. And again, I use this example all the time because she's my absolute favorite client with this. There was a girl named Rachel, and this is literally years ago now, 15, 20 at least years ago. I did a consult at a girls' residential program. So Rachel was the girl I was doing the consult on, and she was doing all this stuff that makes people crazy. I mean, she was running away. She was getting into fights. She was stealing things. She was cutting herself. She was having sex pretty much with anything that moved, even some things that weren't moving. She was all over the place. So I went to do the consult, and the first folks I talked to were the line staff. And they gave me the long list of all the things that Rachel had done and the long list of things they had tried to address it. And they said, we tried everything, nothing works. And then I talked to Rachel's therapist. And Rachel's therapist gave me this lovely little story about, she goes, we use this metaphor with Rachel. You know, like Rachel has this horrible trauma history, so we talk about there are these mountains that you have to overcome, that these obstacles that you have to get over in your life because of all the bad stuff that happened to you. And the problem is that the way you get over the mountains is you climb to the top of the cliff and then you throw yourself off. And not only isn't that a good way to get over the mountain, because one of the problems is you crash and burn on the other side and you hurt yourself, and then you tend to create more mountains and more obstacles for yourself that you have to get over. So the therapist says, so then the metaphor we use is, as you're climbing up the mountain, we want you to notice that there are these trail markers. And you could take the trails, and the trails will take you around the mountain, and you'll be safe, and you'll get to the other side without hurting yourself, without creating more problems for yourself. Cognitive behavioral therapy, basically, is what the metaphor is. You know, what do we say to kids? You know, recognize the red flags. You know, look at your alternate choices. So yeah, great metaphor. I went and talked to Rachel, and Rachel, the reason why she is one of my favorite kids that I've ever worked with is she had no filter. Rachel would tell you anything. So Rachel, Rachel's gone on all the stuff that staff had said, oh yeah, that happened, yeah, I did that, and stuff. And then she said, and let me tell you this other stuff, because I haven't even caught me for this yet, and she's like going on about, I was out one whole night, people didn't even know I was gone. I was back in my bed by the morning, no one was checking on me, and I did this and I did this. It's like, and so as she's going on, and she's quite excited about this, and she's kind of, and I said, yeah, Rachel, I talked to your therapist, and she told me about taking the trails and the paths, and it doesn't sound like you're taking many of the trails, and she just stopped, and she looked at me and she goes, you know what they don't understand? I don't even know I'm climbing up the mountain, until my toes are hanging over the edge of the cliff. And at that point, it seems like there's only one way down, so I'm throwing myself off. We sit there and say to kids, the next time you find yourself being anxious, the next time you find yourself being angry, the next time you find yourself being sexual, the next time you find yourself, when this happens to you, we want you to do this different thing than you've done in the past. But it works under the assumption is I'm recognizing when I'm feeling anxious, just at the beginning state, so I can do something different. As Rachel's telling you, I don't know I'm angry until I'm ready to lose it, So I'm already hyper-aroused. I'm already at that point where I'm dysregulated before it hits me like, oh yeah, there's a problem here. And so unless we put kids back in touch with their bodies at those early stages, then they don't have time to process, okay, what's a different way of handling this now? How do I slow myself down? What are the cues for doing this? So there are a couple of things that we do. One is kind of simple biofeedback stuff with kids. I'll use it on this, but one of the things I do in treatment is track kids' resting heart rates. Talk about that thing and it's a really simple way to do this. As again, there's an app for everything. So this is a real simple app that's on your phone. It's remarkably cleverly called Instant Heart Rate. And it literally is, thing lights up, you put your hand over the camera, and it'll read my heart rate as that blue thing goes all the way around there, okay? I also have little finger monitors that I use for kids in group. I want kids to be able to track their heart rates, okay? Both, one, because it's telling you about their capacity to regulate, but more importantly, in an environment like ours, it's talking about, do they feel safe? Or do I have to stay geared up to keep myself protected? And so the other thing you can use this for is kids oftentimes feel that this stuff just happens to them. And what you want to let them know is you can control this stuff. So one of the things we'll do with tracking your heart rate is, so I'll have kids run in place or do jumping jacks and stuff like that. And they'll take their heart rate before, they'll take their heart rate afterwards and say, oh, if I do this stuff, my heart rate goes up. And then we'll do things like, deep breathing or yoga or something, take our heart rate before or afterwards, and they say, oh, that changes my heart rate. My heart rate's going down. Because oftentimes we'll say to kids, like, take some deep breaths, do some mindfulness, do some yoga, and the kid will do it for 30 seconds and go, yeah, I don't feel any different. This doesn't work for me. And they're not motivated to do it because honestly, because they're not in touch with their bodies, they can't tell if it feels any different. So a lot of what you want to do is show them there is stuff that you can do to control this. And this is what it feels like when your heart's beating really fast, and this is what it feels like when your heart is slowing down. This is what it feels like to be tense, things like progressive muscle relaxation. This is what it feels like to be relaxed. So you're looking for ways, because we know that kids are oftentimes cut off from their bodies, using simple biofeedback tools can help them kind of at least have a way to read what's happening with their bodies during that process. And, again, a lot of the stuff that we use is kind of free. And then the other piece here is learning problems. And this is just kind of important for people to keep in mind, and we'll touch on this a little bit later. But if you are a kid with a trauma history, you have about a 65% greater risk for having an identified learning problem in your life. There is a reason why our jails are full of folks who were first on IEPs or who struggle with reading, who struggle with all kinds of, particularly academic types of learning. As a group, and we'll talk about the neurological reasons for this in a moment, but as a group, the kids we work with struggle with learning. The biggest area of struggle for them is likely to be language-based learning. So these are kids with a much higher incidence of receptive expressive language disorder, central auditory processing disorder, specific reading problems that they have. One of the things that happens all the time, these kids get psychological evaluations or assessments from the school. Sometimes the only number we pay attention to is an IQ score. You really want to look at all the pieces of that. Because sometimes a kid will have a performance IQ in the upper 80s and 90s, and they'll have a verbal IQ down in the mid-60s or low 70s. And so that plays out into an IQ score that puts them in the 70s. But actually what it's telling you is hands-on learning, visual learning, this kid might be really good at that. But they might struggle with language-based learning. The other part of it is, as a group, because you're in human services, because you're in social work, because you're in education, as a group, this is a language-loaded group. One of the reasons why you've gotten to where you've gotten to is because you were pretty good at language-based learning, and you were able to manage that system. That's not our kids. Most of our kids are much better visual learners and hands-on learners than they are verbal learners. So one of the problems is the way we operate is oftentimes remarkably different than the way our kids learn. So we're verbal learners. We like to talk. We like to process things. We sometimes process things we should leave unprocessed. We process them anyway. Okay? We think that if I'm talking to you an hour a week and you don't seem to be getting it, the obvious solution to that is talk to you 2 hours a week. Our kids learn better visually. They learn better hands-on. And so that is on us to think about how do we deliver services to this population. It has to be much more experientially based. It has to be much more visually based. It has to be much more kinesthetically and movement-based. We just have to do a better job. Just sitting and talking to a kid for 50 or 55 minutes is not the answer. It's not that these kids don't love to talk to you. For many of these kids, having that one-on-one attention is great, and they're happy to do that. But it doesn't mean that's how they learn best. And that's how they integrate information, and that's how they're going to remember what it is you told them. And particularly if you're doing skill building with kids, you've got to show them stuff and do it with them and have them practice it a number of times before you think, oh yeah, they're going to be able to go use this somewhere. So a lot of the work for us is getting out of our comfort zone, not just sitting and talking, and actually doing kind of more activity-based, more movement-based types of interactions with kids than we're doing now. And then the other thing I would say is, since we know that trauma is multi-generational in many of these families, if you have a kid with a receptive expressive language problem or a central auditory processing problem, there is a very good chance you are sitting with a parent who has similar kinds of processing difficulties. What that means on a basic level is, think about the environments you work in and the programs you work for. How do we give information to our parents in terms of resources that are available or schedules or things like that? Most public information, and this is also true when you look at assessments on kids, most assessment material is written at a 6th grade and above reading level. There are many of our clients who are not reading at a 6th grade and above reading level. So I can hand you a pamphlet in terms of saying, how do you access the food pantry? Or how do you access housing help? It really might not be a useful, I've handed you information, but your ability to effectively use it, understand it, organize it, and put it into practice is something totally different. So we have to be aware systemically about how do we give information. Sometimes even just assessment materials, like I'll do an evaluation on a kid in our program, and everybody gets a copy of that, okay? So you had DCF and DYS, and the parent gets a copy. Do I expect that all of our parents can just sit down with that evaluation, read it, and actually have a sense of what it means? So, and this is typically why, if I do an evaluation and if I just left it to the parent, what I would get back was all the stuff about the evaluation itself, they would tend to ignore. What they're going to call and argue about is, you know, this piece of, you said we divorced in 2012. It wasn't 2012. That's when we separated. We actually divorced in 2014. That's not even in the report here. And it's like, yeah, that may not be the most important bit of information in the evaluation, but like that's the stuff that I can sort of understand. So you want to be able to sit down with folks and go over it and say, this is what it means. This is how that plays out. This is how we came up with that. And I would argue the same is true with kids. If you are doing assessments of kids, or your organization is doing the assessments and you're working with the kid, take some time to sit down with the kid and actually go over what the assessment says. If you went to the doctors and they did test on you, would you be happy if they never told you what the results of the test were? No. If someone had you sit down for a psychological evaluation and they never gave you what the results were, would you go, yeah, it's not a big deal, not a problem? No, but we have kids who have been in the system for years who have literally been evaluated 12 times. They've never seen the results of the evaluation. They don't know what it says. One of the things the kids ask me most is, can you pull my record out and go over it with me? Now, by the time you get to us, like your records are like this, so it becomes like, kind of what part are you most interested in? And then I just don't hand the stuff with the kid, but I'll say, here's this report. This is when you were 12. You know, this is what it said about you when you were 12. Do you think is that true? Oh, yeah. But then they'll sit there and say, oh, you know, I never knew my dad had a drug problem before or that he had been arrested before. Like, there's tons of stuff in there. Kids don't know their own histories. So, again, think about the way we give information to folks and think about the way we give access to information from folks. Okay. So we want to talk a little bit about neurodevelopment here. So this comes from Marty Teicher in 2002, but I will tell you that he and Janice Sampson just did a review in 2016 of where we're at in terms of the neurological impact of trauma. And all of these continue to hold up. I mean, there's an article every day that gets published around the neurological impact of trauma. So this is not the full and complete list by any means, and we have probably just scratched the surface in terms of our understanding of this. But this stuff has consistently shown to be true. Now again, if I say to you, okay, we're all supposed to be doing evidence-based practice based on the current research, and so here's what the research is telling us. Kids with trauma histories have increased limbic irritability, deficient development in their left hemisphere, deficient left-right hemisphere integration, and limited activation in their cerebellar vermis. That is the research. Please go and practice accordingly. Not so obvious what that stuff is telling you you should do, right? I mean, it's like, what's that even mean? So we'll spend a little bit of time unpacking this stuff. We'll go back to number one, increased limbic irritability. What's that mean? So, trying to think of what slides I put in there. We'll start here just so reference point. Your brain, it's actually divided, McClellan's view, and this is oversimplified, but a nice kind of beginning frame of reference. 3 major areas in your brain. I know there's 4 up there. We're going to make it 3, okay? So you've got your pink part, your brainstem, your lower brain, sometimes referred to as your reptilian brain, okay? Responsible for basically managing your physiological state. So fight and flight, your heart rate, your balance, movement, stuff like that, all of that happening right down here. Next major area, these are where the 2, we're going to combine the 2 of these, okay? It's your limbic system, all right? basically responsible for processing emotions. Literally every sensory input that you get gets an emotional response. Whether it's the lighting in the room, whether it's how hot or cold the room is, whether it's how comfortable the chairs is, whether it's the color of the room, all of that stuff generates an emotional response for you, okay? So literally every bit of stimulus coming in, your brain is processing, responding to that. The blue part around the top, it's your cortex. Cortex is responsible for kind of higher levels of analytical thinking, okay? What we typically begin to think of as learning, but learning is actually going on in all different parts of your brain. And there's really a separate section of this. This is your prefrontal cortex, part up here, right behind your eyebrows. And that's responsible for executive functioning skills, which when I talk to parents about that, I basically say your child's prefrontal cortex is responsible for all the things that they do that make you nuts. Because your prefrontal cortex is responsible for regulating your physical state. So again, how hot or cold it is and what you do in response to that. Regulating your emotional state, so you're not constantly bouncing up and down all day. Focusing your attention, so all those kids on your caseload with attention deficit disorder. Organizing your environment. You walk into your teenager's room and it looks like a bomb went off. Cognitive flexibility, essentially not doing the same stupid thing over and over again, even when you know it's not working for you. And working memory, that ability to hold at least two things in mind at the same time when you're making a decision about something. Absolutely essential if you're trying to do behavior management plans with kids. Because when the consequences in the future, you get a kid on Tuesday who gets frustrated with a teacher, so that has its own immediate interaction. But if the kid knows, oh, if I get kicked out of class, I won't be able to play in the basketball game on Saturday, then he not only has to think about, here's my immediate response to this teacher, he also has to think about, okay, do I want to play basketball on Saturday or not? And how do I have to adjust accordingly? So those are the four kind of major areas of your brain. So now as we get down to increased limbic irritability. People upstairs? Maybe? No. So we're going to start with your amygdala here. Your amygdala is in your limbic system, this little P-shaped thing at the end here. And as it says up there, it's responsible for anxiety and fear, okay, in terms of processing that. What Teicher and others, Michael DeBellis and Joseph Ledoux has found is that with kids with trauma histories, oftentimes their limbic systems are firing off the charts, particularly their amygdalas. They're getting activated all the time because basically if you think about your amygdala being kind of the thermostat in your limbic system, okay, it's set in terms of recognizing, okay, above this threshold, that's scary, okay? And because of our kids' early life experiences, the thermostat's been set really high. So they are now in an environment where the world's a dangerous place, people are out to get me, I can't trust people, I have to be on guard all the time. I always have to watch my back. So they start seeing threat, they're constantly scanning for threat, to the point that they develop what Teicher would call a kindling effect, which means they start seeing threat even in non-threatening situations. So the example would be, new kid comes to school, he sits down, no one's really sitting with him at lunch, there's kids over at the next table, he sees them talking and laughing, he can't hear them, but he assumes they're laughing at me. So if you have the more internalizing kid, he's saying like, yeah, this school sucks, just like all the other schools I've been to. If you have a more externalizing kid, he's getting up out of his seat saying, hey, what the F are you guys laughing at over here? What's your problem? So again, this kind of heightened arousal in your amygdala based on fear. Joseph Ledoux talks about the human brain, all of our brains, forget about trauma, all of our brains give what he calls fast track processing, okay? Kind of non-conscious, immediate, lower level parasympathetic kinds of processing to 2 bits of information in the environment above everything else. And those 2 bits of information are threat cues and, lo and behold, sex cues. Threat and sex get top billing in your brain. It is the reason why sex and violence sells in commercials and movies and books. It is actually the reason why the ads on your TV play louder than the shows do, because once that volume goes up, it pulls your attention back to the source of the loud noise. As annoying as it is, it's going to pull your attention back to it. Okay? So threat and sex, and it's totally evolutionary in nature. The reason why your brain's paying attention to threat cues, because if you don't, you die. The reason why your brain's paying attention to sex cues is because if you don't, as a species, you don't procreate and you die. Okay? So these kids are scanning the environment all the time for threat. And in fact, one of the things that gets argued, and this is particularly true for boys you might be working with, but if you have boys with trauma history, there's an enormously high chance that they've been also diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And frequently, they're misdiagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. It's not that they're struggling paying attention. They are struggling paying attention. But it's really they're struggling paying attention on what we're asking them to attend to. If priority in your brain is for threat cues and sex cues, and I'm scanning the environment constantly for threat, what I'm probably not paying attention to is math and spelling and social studies, because that's way lower on the priority scale. So as long as I'm feeling unsafe, I'm scanning the environment. I'm paying attention to who's talking behind me, what's going on outside, what might be happening. One of the things that we have found is that once you put kids in an environment where they feel safe, lo and behold, their capacity to attend goes up significantly, even without medication. This is not an argument that says there's no such thing as ADHD. There are kids who have not been traumatized who literally have difficulty attending. However, most ADHD in our society does not get diagnosed by a mental health person. Most ADHD in our society gets diagnosed by the combination of a teacher, a parent, and a pediatrician. Kids in school, he's antsy, he's having a hard time focusing, he's physically disruptive. The teacher sits down with Russell Barkley's ADHD checklist. He gets 23 out of 25. Next time we have a parent-teacher conference, I'm sitting down with you and saying, hey, we went through this. Your child's struggling in school. Looks like they might have an attentional problem. The parent then goes to the pediatrician and says, my kid's struggling in school. They say he has an attention problem, and the pediatrician says, well, let's try him on a stimulant and see how they do. And sometimes, initially, the kid will do well. He'll have a period of time where he seems to focus better, but that'll wear off. And as long as the kid's not feeling safe, they're going to have a really hard time attending to what we want them to attend to. So creating safe environments for kids in order to help them learn is really kind of more important than the diagnosis in terms of how we're managing this. Next major area, your hippocampus, crucial to memory and learning facts. One of the things we know about your hippocampus with kids with trauma histories is starting with the initial trauma and going through into adulthood, their hippocampuses are tending to get smaller. They're actually atrophying. This has a couple of implications. First, if you have trouble, and this is particularly true of verbal memory, if you have trouble remembering and learning facts, you're also going to struggle in school. Because as you get older, the demand for memory and learning facts in terms of school performance gets higher and higher. Secondly, in terms of us talking to them about their histories, about what's gone on with them and stuff like that, oftentimes kids are not going to be able to give you the details of that because in terms of what they've incorporated into language, it's a struggle for them. So again, you might not get this full linear, well-organized history when you're talking to kids. You'll get these bits and pieces of stuff. And that's particularly true in terms of cases where kids have been victimized and you turn into the legal system to try to prosecute those cases. They may not be able to give you the full story behind that in terms of their trauma. They're going to give you pieces. I remember, this is back when I first started doing this work, and I was working out at Cambridge Hospital. A girl that came in, we're evaluating, and she had been sexually abused by a teacher in her middle school in the staff lounge after school hours. And when you tried to talk to her about what was the time of day, what else was going on, what day of the week was it, do you know what month of the year it was? Well, it was in the spring, okay? Are we talking March, April, May? How are we defining this? She couldn't really tell you. What she could tell you, there were soda cans on top of the refrigerator in the staff lounge. There were 4 Pepsi cans. There were 4 Sprite cans. There were 3 Coca-Cola cans. There was 1 tab. You know, it's like, I mean, she could give you kind of the details of these kind of situations in the room, but what she couldn't tell you is, what specifically did he say to you? How long did this go on for? It went on for a long time. Is that 5 minutes when you're being abused? Is that a half hour? Is that an hour? She couldn't tell you. So again, oftentimes, both from memory and also from that dissociative aspect of trauma, that stuff is not incorporated into this linear type of story that kids can give you. It impacts your cerebellum. We go back to this. Limited activation of the cerebellar vermis in self-regulation. So what's that mean? Your cerebellum is the seat of motor control and coordination. It's also the seat of, there's a huge number of stress receptors in it that tie right in to your limbic system. So when your infant gets nudgy, what do you tend to do with them? You pick them up and you rock them, right? What that rocking does is activate their cerebellum, and it actually helps them calm down. If there's any occupational therapists in the room, they will tell you that heel-to-toe rocking or side-to-side rocking is naturally relaxing. It's the reason why rocking chairs and porch swings and hammocks are all thought of things that you relax on, because actually what they're doing is activating your cerebellum. What do we tend to do with kids when they're becoming dysregulated, especially as they get older? Sit down, be still, be quiet. Maybe the 3 hardest directives that you could give to these kids. Oftentimes when we want kids to regulate, what we actually have to do with them is put them in motion. Now, this is not running them around, okay? One of the things that happens sometimes, particularly because many of these kids are diagnosed with attention deficit disorders, and they're seen as hyperactive, what people will say is, let's take them out at recess and just like run them to death. You know, like if they just burn off a lot of energy, they'll be calmer when they come in the afternoon. And for some kids, some of these kids need to burn off a lot of energy. But if you see a kid kind of getting dysregulated in the moment, what you do not want to do is engage them in high-level physical activity. Because what happens in high-level physical activity, your heart beats faster. Your large muscle groups get engaged. You start sweating, and from a physiological point of view, it feels like that same response to a kind of fight and flight piece. So when you want kids to regulate in the moment, what you're looking for is slow, structured, rhythmic movement. Something as basic as come take a walk with me is a slow, structured, rhythmic movement. But having a rocking chair available, having one of those big exercise balls that kids could roll back and forth on. Sometimes just, you know, with some kids, I will I'll literally just sit on the floor with them, kind of put my feet against their feet, grab their hands, and while I'm talking to them, we're doing this. This does a couple of things from a physiological point of view. First of all, you're grounded. Your butt's literally on the ground, okay? So you've got something solid underneath you. Secondly, I'm using touch as a way to keep the kid connected with me. And third, I can actually use pressure in my feet, kind of pushing more up against that. And I'm activating their cerebellum by rocking back and forth. So you can look for ways and have ways available for kids and teach kids ways to do this on a regular basis if you're thinking about, I'm trying to get this kid to regulate. We will have kids do what we call wall push-ups, which is literally just like it sounds. Do this. And sometimes as a way to co-regulate them, you put pressure on their back, because deep pressure, that sort of large muscle proprioceptive stimulation, can help kids feel contained. So people may use things like weighted blankets and stuff like that. It's the same sort of notion behind that, okay, that large muscle group stimulation actually helps particularly aggressive kids stay more contained. So sometimes, again, a lot of times traumatized kids don't want you touching them, particularly on their back, because they can't see what's going on, okay? But for some kids, if they trust you, putting that extra pressure on their back and allowing them to push against that can be really helpful for those kids. Also things like wall sits, or what we call power sits. Again, just kind of getting kids grounded when they're really becoming dysregulated and helping them. And you can't do this for a long time. I can't do it for a long time. Kids can do it for longer. But oftentimes I'll just sit across from them in a room and we'll both be doing this. And you'll see a kid like, and it's like, Tony, you might want to breathe. Do you realize that your fists are all clenched up? You might want to just shake those hands out a little bit. But the other thing this does is it gives you that large muscle group, that proprioceptive stimulation, and it helps kids feel grounded and contained. So looking for ways to begin to help them regulate through body-based kind of activities becomes really useful and important. It's the reason why things like yoga and Tai Chi and those things are also good for kids, because they're slow and structured and rhythmic. And then they also then incorporate breathing, which is also slowing down your heart rate in that process. Does that make sense to folks? Your cortex, we talked about your brain being divided 3 parts, bottom to top. It also has 2 sides. You have a right hemisphere and a left hemisphere. They are not the same, okay? There's a slide up here that describes it better. We'll come back for this. This is a lot of stuff we just talked about. This. So you have a right hemisphere and a left hemisphere, okay? Your right side, and I guess I should first say normal brain development, okay, for human beings. Bottom to top, right to left, back to front, okay? There's a test on this later. Bottom to top, right to left, back to front, okay? That's how normal brain development goes. So when you're first born, all right, every one of us is a right hemisphere dominant individual, okay? If you looked at your brain in childhood, the 2 hemispheres would not be equal. By volume, your right hemisphere would be larger than your left hemisphere. Your right side is for the big picture stuff. Creativity, visuals, tone of voice, okay? Again, illustration, so visual, simultaneous things happening in unison with one another. Just think about this developmentally. It makes sense. When you're an infant, what are you doing? You're looking at the world. You're responding to the tone of voice of your mother. Again, she could be reading War and Peace to you, but if she's doing it in that sing-songy kind of voice, then that's fun. We're going to kind of do that together. It's big picture stuff. It's symbols, visual memory, gross motor skills, not a real sense of time, okay? And it's controlling the left side of your body. So those are the right hemisphere stuff. But think about that in terms of the way our kids operate, okay? What's on the left side? Language, logical, sequential, okay, doing things in order, attending to detail, auditory memory, thinks according to rules and patterns, having fine motor skills, having a sense of time, planning things out. Any of those problems for the kids that you work with? Yeah, there's a reason for that. Because, as the research said, one of the things we found out with trauma histories is that kids with trauma histories, the left side of their brains don't develop as much. Lack of development in the left hemisphere. Okay? So all of us, we start out right hemisphere dominant. Right hemisphere has more volume than your left hemisphere. Over time, your left hemisphere develops, and actually by the time most of us get into mid to late adolescence, our left hemispheres are actually larger in volume than our right hemispheres, especially if you're a right-handed person. Okay? That happens for almost everyone, except if you have a trauma history. If you have a trauma history, you tend to remain right hemisphere dominant. See where it says spontaneous there? You could read that as impulsive. Okay? It also means the tone of voice that you use with kids is as important as the content that you use with kids. It also explains why language-based learning difficulties are prominent with our kids, because language is on the left side of your brain. What's that mean for practice? Again, where are the kids' strengths? Visuals, tone, big picture stuff, stories, illustrations. That's how these kids are learning better. That's where they're inclined to learn better. What it also means is, and again, I've kind of used this example a lot, but this happened in our program. We'll have people come up and I'll say, the kid has language-based learning problems, and staff or parents will say, you tell me my kid has problems processing language. My kid knows the words to every rap song ever written by mankind, okay? And not only do they know the words, they pick them up like this. They listen to the song 2 or 3 times. I'm trying to figure out what the title of the song is. This kid's singing it back to me. Okay? So it's not about the fact that he can't process language. It's about the fact of what language he's motivated to process. He wants to learn the rap song, so he learns it. He doesn't want to remember what we talked about in group the other day, or what his chores are, or what his math problems are. He's not interested. All of a sudden, he's got a language-based learning problem. I'm not going to argue that motivation doesn't impact learning. But why would a kid maybe have an easier time remembering the words to the rap song than they would to what we talked about in group the other day? Anybody? He's relaxed, okay.
Rap music is very creative, has a beat behind it, the rhyme.
The beat and the rhyme.
Yeah.
Do you know?
Can I say?
Go ahead.
The music too, isn't that on the right side of the brain?
Yes, that's exactly right.
More creative?
And that's where the beat and the rhyme is at also. That tonality and that sort of, the reason why mothers talk to their kids in those sing-songy voices when they're infants is because that's what kids respond to. Literally, everybody in this room learned the alphabet. How? You sang a song, right? If you were a slow learner like me, it took you a while to figure out that elemento was not 1 letter, but 4. Okay? But you sang a song. And even now, when you have to put things in alphabetical order, what do? You're like, you're singing the song. Not that I necessarily have personal experience with this, but if a policeman stops you when they think you're driving under the influence, and they're giving you a roadside sobriety test, and if they ask you for the alphabet, you're not allowed to sing it. You have to say it. I just heard. I'm not saying that I have a personal experience of that. Again, that kind of rhythm and rhyme in stuff makes it easier for kids to remember. My favorite example of this, nothing to do with therapy, O.J. Simpson trial, okay? 5 days of forensic testimony, blood spatter, knife wounds, footprints, DNA testing, all this kind of stuff. Johnny Cochran probably never took a neuropsychology class in his life, okay, but he knows how people learn. So what did Johnny Cochran do? He does his cross-examination of all the forensic evidence, but when he goes by the jury box, he stops and says, if the glove doesn't fit, you must acquit. And he says it over and over and 5 days worth. Every time he stops and the glove doesn't fit, you must acquit. And 2 days after that, they get them to bring the glove in. OJ can't get it on his hand. I don't have to disprove that 5 days of forensic testimony. I just have to raise a doubt. Simple, repeated language. Folks who have ever heard Charlie Applestein talk. He's a guy therapist who works with a lot of kids with trauma histories. He's literally got a CD out about rhymes and raps for kids. And as opposed to the 5-minute lecture about why you shouldn't kind of become dysregulated, a simple phrase like, don't be a fool, just stay cool, is a much easier way to process stuff. One of the ways that I use this, so I do group 3 days a week with kids. On Fridays, I will sit there and bullet point, these are the take-home messages from group this week. Okay? These are the top 1 or 2 things I want you to remember. Your homework is write a rhyme or a rap that incorporates that in. We'll talk, after we break here in a moment, we'll talk a little bit about attunement and how that works with attachment. I talk about attunement a lot, so I will tell you the attunement rap for our group. You got to be attuned, that's no lie. Got to know what you're feeling and the reason why. Yeah, you got to be attuned, that's what I think. Pay attention to others and be in sync. So I didn't write that. The kids wrote that. Kids who graduate will do a whole rap for what I learned in group. And again, it's both a way to engage them in the process, but it's also a way to help them remember. When we go over attunement 4 months from now, I am not going to say, who remembers what we talked about when we talked about attunement? I'm going to say, who remembers the attunement rap? And then we'll have the discussion about what's it mean to be in sync with people? How does attunement help you understand your own feelings as well as other people? Then we can have the discussion. But we're going to start with, what's the attunement rap? So again, there's a reason why, like kids' educational television, like literally every one of those shows has a song or some little ditty. There's a reason why you can remember obscure ads from your childhood. If I asked you, do you wish you were an Oscar Mayer Wiener? You could probably tell me about that, right? I was literally talking with somebody, a friend of mine who grew up in New Jersey the other day, and those of you of a certain age who grew up in the Jersey, New York area, there was apparently a soda brand called Hoffman's. I don't know if people know that up here. I grew up in Philly. Hoffman's was not in Philadelphia. However, every year we went to my uncle's house in New Jersey. And literally from the age of like 6 to 9, the Hoffman soda commercial was, the prettiest girl I ever saw was sipping Hoffman's right through a straw. The prettiest girl I ever saw was sipping Hoffman's through a straw. I have never had a Hoffman soda in my life.
We learned that song in camp.
What?
We learned that in camp.
To Hoffman's? No, to the tune, sure. I mean, you think they make all this stuff up? Come on. But it's that stuff, there's a reason why when your kids were young, you were singing the Carmen Sandiego song. There's a reason why the song that never ends, okay? It's really the way little kids' brains work. And the fact that you remember that stuff, if you were at a certain age, that's when it has its biggest impact on you. And that's why you remember the theme songs from, stupid shows that you watched when you were a kid. Because your right brain is processing that piece. So it's important to think about how do you translate that into treatment? How do you make that a part, that understanding? So thinking about simple, repeated phrases with rhythm and rhyme really becomes important to helping kids remember and integrate the stuff that they learn in therapy, in skill buildings group, in whatever. If you can put the sequence of events for how you want the kid to do a particular task in a rhythm or a rhyme or a little rap, they're going to remember that. There's a reason when you were a kid they try to teach you all the capitals of the states by singing songs and stuff, right? I mean, that's the whole idea behind it because that's how little kids learn. But it's also how kids with trauma histories learn because of that lack of left hemisphere development. Okay? Let's take a break for just like 10 minutes and then we'll kind of come back. So I guess the first question I would say is any questions or comments on stuff that we've touched on so far? Yes? No? We're good with that?
I wanted to comment that working with people with stroke, left side,
Yes.
singing nursery rhymes is a great way to start. And of course, you can do the motion and all the things that you mentioned to get the three muscle groups loosen and get them into a better frame of mind. Or if they're highly sexualized and wanting all this excitement because they're scared, you can take them and have some vigorous walks and stuff, and it reduces all of those things down.
Yeah, and particularly for people who work in schools too, there's a fair amount of research now that shows that if you, like schools have tried first thing in the morning, taking kids out and sort of just doing a run with them or doing some exercise with them has increased, productivity in school and learning in school. So being aware of that connection between your brain and your body is really important, not only for self-regulation, but for things like attention and processing and all those pieces. For those obsessive-compulsive people in the group who say, oh, but you missed 8 slides, one of the things you will notice is that we actually have covered the material on those slides already. So not to panic like we're, like that we're going out of order. There was a piece in this deficient development of the left-right hemisphere. So one of the things researchers have found is that for folks with trauma histories, but also for people with fetal alcohol syndrome, their corpus callosums are smaller. So your corpus callosum on that initial brain slide is that white thing that was in the middle there. It is basically the fiber tract that's connecting your right hemisphere and your left hemisphere. And what they have found for folks with trauma histories is that they're smaller. So the integration of information and how this kind of shows itself is our folks tend to be very concrete learners. And the other part that it's sometimes hard to take information you learned in one setting and apply it in another setting. So, you'll do conflict resolution in therapy or group therapy or family therapy, and they go, oh, that worked really good. And then the notion that you could use that in school or with your friends or with the staff, like, yeah, that's totally different. And so it's important to understand that you'll get that kind of very compartmentalized learning. And a lot of our job becomes connecting the dots. You say, okay, here's that skill you learned in group. How could you use that with your mom? How could you use that in school? How could you use that with your friends? So making it very specific, because oftentimes they're not going to see that connection. And it's really hard for them to do that more generalized learning piece, which also makes it difficult in school. So you'll see that with kids with math problems, okay? Because the way math is taught is, okay, you know, we're going to learn addition and then subtraction and then division, and we're going to take all those skills, and then we get to the more complicated stuff, we're going to be able to use all those. And they're like going, yeah, what are you talking about? Like, I had never heard this before. And it's like, no, can you do addition? And it's like, well, yeah, but that's different than this. So making those connections is hard, whether it's on a social level or on just a straight learning skill level. You have to help them sort of see the connections here. And because sometimes we just assume that kids will get that. And these guys, not because they're dumb, not because they're not motivated, simply because it's harder neurologically for these kids to do that kind of integration and to kind of do that kind of learning. The other thing, because of that lack of integration between the left and right hemisphere, trauma experiences themselves are oftentimes compartmentalized. Sounds, smells, you know, different kind of cues that they have a hard time connecting and integrating in terms of, you know, why do I get scared by this? And they can't kind of tell you the story why. But it's because it's kind of compartmentalized. And again, it's not this kind of linear story. And it's the reason why treatment interventions that promote bilateral stimulation. So certainly stuff like EMDR, but even just for people familiar with like brain gym from a learning point of view, the reason why there's doing all those cross midline movements. So things in brain gym, you know, this would be a cross crawl, or you get kids who walk, you know, doing walking with their arms going back and forth. Or again, people old enough to remember the monkeys when they used to walk together, sort of going down the street like this, you know. Those crossing movements, there's a reason why they help, and it's because it's sort of doing that bilateral stimulation piece with folks. All right. Developmental insults that most frequently lead to behavior problems. There's nothing up there that's going to surprise you. The order might surprise you a little bit. This comes from the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. The stuff we tend to focus on is down here: sexual abuse, neglect, physical abuse. The other stuff, emotional abuse, loss of important relationships, impaired caregivers, domestic violence, is impacting more kids. All of the numbers are high. The reason why I put it up there now is when I look at that, I actually see 5 of those 7s are disruptions in attachment relationships. Emotional abuse, loss of important emotional relationship, impaired caregivers, domestic violence, and neglect, really when you're talking about trauma with kids, usually come from their home environments and are disruptions in attachment. If, on top of that, the perpetrator of your sexual abuse and physical abuse was also one of your primary caretakers, then you get 7 for 7. Attachment is a big deal. Again, from a resiliency point of view, the presence of a consistent, supportive, emotionally available adult in your life. However, if we took just a little poll in here and I said, do you think attachment's important? My guess is most people would raise their hand. If I then said to you, okay, a kid comes to you with an attachment, and you know that they struggle with attachments, how do you treat that? What do you do? Oftentimes, people sit there and go, I try to be really nice and open and emotionally available. What we know is that you can take these kids and place them in home environments that are very positive, where the adults seem to be very invested in them, and they still struggle with making attachments. So as we go through this attachment piece, I want people to be able to think about, how do you deal with attachment relationships? How do you treat attachments? Attachment theory, maintenance of proximity, secure and trusted figure needed by human beings throughout their lifetime, especially during periods of threat and stress. We use attachments throughout our lifetime. It's not just little kids who need attachment. That capacity to feel safe for kids is basically rooted in attachment. Human beings are biologically wired to form attachment relationships. The reason why you're biologically wired to form attachment relationships is this. The primary goal of attachment is not so you will have a warm, fuzzy relationship with your mom. The primary goal of attachment is safety. The reason why human beings are biologically wired to form attachment relationships is because if you don't, you die. If a child cannot find a way to engage an adult to meet their needs, they are not going to survive. The primary goal of attachment is safety. The secondary goal of attachment is what we typically think of attachment, the social piece, the affiliation piece. But the primary goal of attachment is safety, which is why so many kids with trauma history have attachment problems, because they weren't safe. They haven't experienced safety. So they don't know how to get there. There are basically two pieces to the attachment process. One is attunement, or what the brain researchers would call serve and return. And then the second is the behavioral piece, which is engagement and maintenance. What do I have to do to get your attention? What do I have to do to keep your attention? One of the real difficulties that we have systemically oftentimes is, one, we set up behavior management plans that make attachment the contingency. If you have a really good week, you'll be able to have lunch at school with your favorite staff person. Or if you do such and, if you behave, you'll be able to go on your home visit, or you'll be able, whatever those pieces are. The problem with that is that's not how normal development works. Again, think about with your own kids. You don't sit your own kids down in the morning and say, okay, guys, here's what we expect of you in school. Here are your chores. If you do all the stuff we're asking you to do, maybe when you come home tonight from school, we'll pay attention to you. And if you were really good today, maybe we'll feed you. It's like, yeah, you get that just for being a kid. One of the biggest complaints that you oftentimes hear from classroom teachers and people in programs is, he's just doing that for attention. And when they bring it up, like if I come in to do a consult and they say, he's doing all this for attention, either the explicit or implied message is, can you come up with an intervention that will stop them from needing attention? It's like, no, I cannot. They are 10 or 12 or 16. It is not pathological to want attention. It also does not mean I have to be one-on-one with this kid the whole time or have them on my hip 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The question becomes, how do we persistently attend to this kid without having them sit right next to the teacher's desk or whatever? And there are ways to do that. One, if you're working with a number of staff, the general functioning, say, within a youth center or a church group or something like that is, you attend to everybody. Like usually those are broken up, like you have this group and you have this group and you have this group. But there are some kids who they need a lot of attention. And what do we tend to do is that we tend to give our attention not to the most well-behaved, compliant child in the room. The kids who get the greatest level of adult attention tend to be the most provocative, acting out kids. So if I've got a group of 12 kids and they're all looking for attention, and what I focus my response to are the most provocative acting out kids, then what you're going to see is a lot of provocative acting out kids, because the message is going to be, that's how you're going to get attended to. That's how you're going to be taken care of. So from a straight behavior management point of view, It doesn't mean you ignore disruptive behavior. Because if you ignore disruptive behavior, and we are accurate in saying the kid's doing that for attention, the message to the kid is, if you ignore this disruptive behavior, boy, I'm going to have to bump it up a notch in order to get somebody to pay attention to me. And the great thing about the kids we work with is they don't have to think very hard about what it means to bump it up a notch. They have a sort of repertoire of behaviors that they know you will pay attention to. So again, the difference is when you're dealing with disruptive behavior, to deal with it in a matter-of-fact, kind of not emotionally charged way. It's like, yep, we don't do that here. Yep, the consequence for that is this. Moving on. What you save your energy for and the excitement for are the kids that are doing well. For the kids who are, being compliant, being positive, learning new skills, and doing that stuff. That's the stuff you get excited about. Instead, what we tend to do, and believe me, we do this with our own kids too, that the basic behavior management sort of ratio would say 4 positives for every negative. Think about that. 4 positives for every negative. Donald Meichenbaum did a study back in the late 90s that basically suggested that adolescents get somewhere in the range of about 800 compliance commands every day. 1, if you think your adolescent is going to be compliant with all 800 of those commands, you are going to be a very disappointed and frustrated parent. But secondly, just think of that as a process. So you go, 800. But things like, get out of bed, make your bed. Did you remember to brush your teeth? Do you have your books? Do you have, you go into a classroom. Everybody come in, sit down at your desk, take out your book, turn to page 32, start reading. Those are like 4 compliance commands literally in less than 5 seconds. And typically in a classroom, if you got 22 kids in a class, maybe 21 of them are going to take out their books, turn to page 32, and start reading. And when they do that, we just go on, right? What do we save our time for? The one kid who doesn't take out his book. Then it becomes, Bonnie, is there a problem? Whoa, what were we supposed to do? Somehow everybody in the class figured out what they were supposed to do. Why is it that you didn't figure out what to do? Now I'm going to take 5 minutes to kind of focus on the one kid who didn't get it. And now 21 other kids are sitting there like on, yeah. So if you do what you're told to do, you get nothing. You don't even get a thanks. And this happens at home too. You ask your kid to clean up their room, and they clean up their room. You go, oh, I'm on a roll. Hey, why don't you take out the trash too? Why don't you do the lawn? It's like I'm going to go until you're going to not do it anymore. So it's like, so again, you don't have to throw a party for kids every time they're compliant, but recognizing it, tell everybody, take out your books. They all take out their books. Thanks, guys. That makes it easier. Turn to page 32. Everyone turns to page 32. Great, we're on a roll. Bonnie, start reading. You just kind of go through that process where you're acknowledging when kids are being positive and compliant and engaged, as opposed to just assuming that's what's supposed to happen. And then when somebody doesn't, now we're going to get focused. Now we're going to get energetic. Now we're going to pay a lot of attention to that. Because the message is, that's what it takes to engage you. What you focus on is going to grow. If you're going to focus on the negative, you're going to see a lot of negative. So this is just a little piece about serve and return. And for folks who don't know this, this is a great resource. The Center for the Developing Child at Harvard has a great website, all little kinds of videos, different kinds of papers and research and stuff available, all free. So.
A child's experiences during the earliest years of life have a lasting impact on the architecture of the developing brain. Genes provide the basic blueprint, but experiences shape the process that determines whether a child's brain will provide a strong or weak foundation for all future learning, behavior, and health. During this important period of brain development, billions of brain cells called neurons send electrical signals to communicate with each other. These connections form circuits that become the basic foundation of brain architecture. Circuits and connections proliferate at a rapid pace and are reinforced through repeated use. Our experiences and environment dictate which circuits and connections get more use. Connections that are used more grow stronger and more permanent. Meanwhile, connections that are used less fade away through a normal process called pruning. Well-used circuits create lightning-fast pathways for neural signals to travel across regions of the brain. Simple circuits form first, providing a foundation for more complex circuits to build on later. Through this process, neurons form strong circuits and connections for emotions, motor skills, behavioral control, logic, language, and memory during the early critical period of development. With repeated use, these circuits become more efficient and connect to other areas of the brain more rapidly. While they originate in specific areas of the brain, the circuits are interconnected. You can't have one type of skill without the others to support it. Like building a house, everything is connected, and what comes first forms a foundation for all that comes later.
So just a couple of pieces to that. One is that whole notion of how you do serve and return with the folks that you work with. So again, always acknowledging, folks, if you work in a large program or in a school or in a community center or something like that, you literally should not walk by a kid, even if you don't know them, without acknowledging them. Just, hey, how's it going today? Hey, you got new sneaks? You know, it's like, whatever that is. If it's a group of guys, hi guys, how's it going today? Just some acknowledgement so adults aren't walking by them. How you greet people, again, think about that right side stuff. Tonality, body language, all of that stuff makes a huge difference for folks. The other thing is you might sit there and say, yeah, that's really interesting, but I don't work with infants. I'm not teaching them to read or write. I'm not going to read a storybook to them. What we do a lot, though, is we teach kids an emotional language. I don't know about you. Most of the kids I work with tend to talk about their feelings in very dichotomous terms. I'm either happy or I'm angry. It's either good or it's bad. Very little gray area in between. It might shift from moment to moment, but it's very little gray area in between. You'll do things with kids like have them, you know, for group, we would oftentimes have kids check in by a number. You know, where are you at on a number? Kids are 1 or they're 10, you know? And it's like, guys, you know, or I had a kid come in the other day. Well, I'm 50% of 1 and 50% of 10. So that means you're like a 5. No. Like I'm a 1 about this stuff and I'm a 10 about this stuff. It's like, yeah, so overall, you're a 5 or maybe a 4 or maybe, it's, you know, if it's not quite 50-50. And he like goes, no, Kevin, what the, you don't get it. Like I'm a 1 because I'm pissed off about this and I'm a 10 because the rest of this is pretty good. It's like, yeah, most of life is lived between like, you know, 3 and 7, you know? I mean, it's like, you know, like, and I constantly say like, 10 is like the greatest day of your life. You know, 10 is like, yeah, I'm a 10. You know, it's like, you know, something doesn't feel like you're a 10, you know? First of all, you're sitting in a residential treatment program, you know? Like that may not be a 10 for you. But it's kind of talking about how, so it's really hard for these kids to kind of have a way to talk about that other stuff. And the other thing, they have a tendency to talk about anger. The kids who come to our program, because they're there because they've acted out behaviorally, sexually and aggressively, they tend not to talk about the sexual stuff, but they're happy to talk about the anger stuff. And the anger stuff is oftentimes, if you know, trying to talk to kids about, there are the things that make you angry. Angry is almost never the first emotion that you feel. You know, you think about the things that make you angry. You get frustrated, then you get angry. You get disappointed, then you get angry. You get embarrassed or humiliated, then you get angry. You get annoyed, then you get angry. You know, you get sad or hurt, then you get angry. One of the reasons for kids with trauma that it's much easier to talk about anger than it is all that other stuff is think about those other feelings. Those are all really vulnerable feelings. Sadness and hurt and disappointment and frustration and humiliation and embarrassment and shame. Anger feels a lot more protective. Anger, I can defend myself. So it's a lot easier to talk about being angry than it is to talk about being sad or hurt or disappointed. So a lot of the work that we do is try to get them to kind of in that serve and return kind of way and in that developmental kind of way. Let's start with, what do you start with when, what does anger look like for you? And talk about that. Sometimes doing it via videos and stuff. Part of attachment is attunement, and attunement is that ability to accurately read those cues from people in terms of what the meaning of that is. And these kids struggle with that. That's a neurological difficulty. That's a brain-based result of poor attachment early, as they have a hard time recognizing and evaluating the meaning of nonverbal cues. So a lot of that you have to practice by showing them stuff. So like a lot of times what I'll do is take really short film clips, usually with people, just like one or two faces with people interacting, turn off the sound, play like, a few minutes and say, tell me the story. What's their relationship? What are they feeling? And then why do you think that? What's going on there that makes you think that? And then I'll put the sound on and you'll get the words. And it's like, does that fit or not fit? So you get them to practice that. But also, what's that like for them themselves? So we'll do, I think it's the next thing up here. No, somewhere right here. So we'll do stuff like this. So this is a visual way. So you just make a heart. We've identified, different kids have identified different colors that go with different feelings. And so it's just say, kind of give me the snapshot of what's going on for you right now in terms of how you feel. So you'll notice here, we got anger, we got hatred, okay? Love, happiness, much smaller. I love this, evilness, which is actually different than hatred. And then goodness, So again, just another way for kids to kind of feel about this. This is another one. Depressed, aggressive, bored. Notice how they all go together. Silly, and then gay on top of that. So that's one way. The other, so we do colors, we do sounds. So once we've matched, everyone has seen those like little facial charts with emotions. So first of all, in those charts, way too many emotions. Like, I can't figure out the difference between some of those. I can't help them figure out the difference between some of those. So narrow that down, so like it's 8 or 10, maybe. Then take a face. Then we put the face with a color, and it can vary from kid to kid. And then we'll put it with a sound, not a song. Kids want to say, oh, I know a sad song. Let me, it's like, no, what's a sad sound? So a sad sound could be like an oboe playing. A sad sound could be like a violin being kind of drawn across, or someone crying. An angry sound could be someone screaming, could be a fire engine, could be glass smashing, could be all kinds of things. So kids will have different sounds to go with it. And then we'll also put it in your body. So it's like, show me your happy walk, show me your sad walk, show me your angry walk, show me your scared walk. So we want to kind of have kids kinesthetically experience what that is. And then we'll do things like we'll play emotion charades, so you make it a game, okay? You have to go show me the emotion, and I have to guess it. Now, one of the problems is kids will sit there, and if they're playing a game and they want to win, they'll just throw every emotion word out there until they get the right one. So a kid literally will have done nothing yet. Like he'll walk in the room and people go, sad, happy, mad. It's like, yeah, that's not going to work, So, 2 wrong answers, you lose a point. So you have to be a little bit more thoughtful and slow down a little bit in order to do that. But the other part is, not only do you get a point for guessing the right emotion, but the person who does it gets 2 points for being able to convey accurately to you and communicate what they're actually feeling. Because some kids will go in, and it's like, okay, what are we doing here? And the kid's like, and so kids will say, do something else, and they'll go. And it's like, yeah, that's not really helping us very much, you know? And it's like, and they're in their mind, they're like being really emotive here. And sometimes you literally, I've done like holding mirrors up to kids, like going, that's what it looks like, you know? Tell me what it is you're feeling, you know? Because I can't figure it out just from that. So again, making kids aware of how they're conveying, how they're communicating that stuff. So as I talked about, attachment and brain, so positive experiences of attunement when you're younger actually leads to the capacity to regulate emotionally, to respond to social cues, and to evaluate the meaning of other people's messages, of their nonverbal communication. So this is the best example.
Babies this young are extremely responsive to the emotions and the reactivity and the social interaction that they get from the world around them. This is something that we started studying 30, 40 years ago, when people didn't think that infants could engage in social interaction. In the still face experiment, what the mother did was she sits down and she's playing with her baby, who's about a year of age.
I'm my girl. Oh.
And she gives a greeting to the baby gives a greeting back to her.
Yeah.
This baby starts pointing at different places in the world, and the mother's trying to engage her and play with her. They're working to coordinate their emotions and their intentions, what they want to do in the world. And that's really what the baby is used to. And then we ask the mother to not respond to the baby. The baby very quickly picks up on this, and then she uses all of her abilities to try and get the mother back. She smiles at the mother. She points because she's used to the mother looking where she points. The baby puts both hands up in front of her and says, "What's happening here?" She makes that screechy sound at the mother, like, come on, why aren't we doing this? Even in this 2 minutes, when they don't get the normal reaction, they react with negative emotions, they turn away, they feel the stress of it, they actually may lose control of their posture because of the stress that they're experiencing.
Okay. I'm here. And what are you doing? Oh, yes. Oh, what a big girl.
It's a little like the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good is that normal stuff that goes on, that we all do with our kids. The bad is when something bad happens, but the infant can overcome it. After all, when you stop the still face, the mother and the baby start to play again. The ugly is when you don't give the child any chance to get back to the good. There's no reparation, and they're stuck in that really ugly situation.
So again, a lot of our kids grew up in the ugly, okay? They didn't have those attachment pieces. So if we're going to work on attachment skills, one of the things you have to do is work on attunement. So real quickly, and particularly since you guys have been sitting a long time, I want everybody to get up. We have to do this quick. Everybody get up, get a partner. Find a partner. You're facing them. Can't be across the table from you, so like get closer to them. Okay, so some real quick attunement exercises. So first one is a straight mirroring exercise. So all this is one person's the leader, one person's the follower, okay? You have to maintain eye contact, and it's just doing what the leader does. So it's going to look like this. What's your name? Marita. Marita, just turn for a second. So I'm going to lead, all right? Okay, go. Okay, very nice. Stop. Stay with your partner, though. Conversation. One person's word is yes. The other person's word is no. Sounds like this. Yes.
No.
Yes.
No.
Yes.
No.
Yes. No. Yes.
No.
Go ahead. Very good. Okay. You guys are really good at this stuff. Next. Yes. Okay. No. So the next, I want you to do just yes, but I want you to do it really soft at first, and then go really loud, and then come back down to really soft again. So it's going to be like this. Yes. Yes. Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Yes. Yes. Yes.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Go ahead. Bring it back down. Bring it back down. Okay. So you're so good at this. This is something a little more challenging. Okay. People here, some people here are old enough. There used to be a song and a dance back in the late 60s, early 70s, hand jive. Okay. People remember the hand jive. Okay. Okay. So the basic steps. The basic steps of the hand, we're not going to do this part because that gets way too confusing for people. Okay? So the basic steps of the hand jive were here, here, okay? Here. Then you clap. Then it becomes, I'm sorry, confuse you. Then it's right, clap, left, clap, back, clap. Okay? So here, 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 clap, right, clap, left, clap, hands, clap. Okay? Go ahead. Okay? You got the basics down, okay? So now I want you to do it as fast as you possibly can. Okay? Ready? Go. Okay, very good. Have a seat. So, couple of things in that. First off, what did people notice happened in the room when we started doing this? Yeah, a lot more laughter. Energy tends to go up. Like, again, human beings are biologically wired to form attachment. We like kind of doing this stuff. But there's another piece of this, and there's a number of, literally anything where you have to be in sync with the other person can be an attunement exercise. So, group jump rope is an attunement exercise. Both people have to be attuned, swinging it. Everybody has to be attuned, jumping up and down at the same time. Drumming is a great attunement exercise. So oftentimes in group with folks, I will just sit there, and there's two ways of doing it. One is just you create a beat, and that beat has to travel all the way around the room, and then it comes back to me, and I change the beat, and it comes back around, and you begin to make it like just we were doing with the hand jive, except what's that really look like? Patty cake. Patty cake is a developmental exercise, and the reason why it gets passed on from generation to generation is because it meets a developmental need. It's an attunement exercise, just like peekaboo is an object constancy exercise. And kids will do that stuff for hours. The other thing, and we can kind of all do this together since you have a table in front of you. So what I want you to do is we're going to create a beat, really soft to begin with. And so everybody's just going to, real soft. But everybody has to be together. A little louder. A little louder. A little louder. Louder. Soft. So this is, nice job. This is both a self-regulation, but it's also being attuned to where everybody else is at. And I will tell you what happens with our kids when they do this. They're really good at everybody being on the beat when it's soft. Soon as you get loud, they lose it. Because what begins to happen is they'll go soft and you go louder, and they're with you, and then you go louder and you're with it, and then you go loud. Everyone's doing their own stuff, you know, and it's like, whoa, guys, we're all supposed to be doing this together, you know? So what happens is higher levels of arousal, tendency is to stop paying attention to other people. They get kind of more dysregulated, and you have to kind of bring it back down again. So again, all different ways that you can begin to work on attunement skills, just paying attention to what's going on with people. Yes? Yep.
I found that although some of us, including myself, are extremely clumsy and making mistakes, nobody seems to get upset about the mistake.
Right.
The positive psychology, this is a great learning experience, you know. Unless you make mistakes, you can't get it right.
And not only that, when you ask particularly kids and especially adolescents to do stuff, if you are willing to make mistakes and you're willing to look ridiculous, then they're willing to look ridiculous. We've kind of talked about this already, and I know we haven't got a lot of time left, but the way I do treatment is I really work at it from a developmental focus. And we talked in the beginning, like why do a developmental treatment approach. First of all, it focuses on skill development and adaptive skills and resiliency as opposed to pathology. Secondly, it's much more like what we're doing with our own kids in terms of our goals for treatment. It makes it easier to engage. Yes?
Sorry, it's in along with this. So when you're focusing on developmental focus, are you thinking developmental in terms of where they are mentally and their mental capacities developmentally, or are you talking cognitively and not cognitively age-based? So if I have a 17-year-old who's cognitively functioning at like a 12-year-old level due to the trauma that he's experienced or she's experienced, do you drop it down and go into...
Hang on one sec. I just want to show you what it looks like in kind of practical terms here. Because hopefully so this is the way we've broken it down developmentally. We've sort of divided into 6 developmental domains. Okay? Attachment, self-regulation, cognitive skills, social skills, adaptive living skills, and because literally every kid in our program has a sexual behavior problem, healthy sexuality, although I would argue that's a good thing to have in there anyway. And it looks like this. So, and I know you can't read that. So, but the way it looks is when we sit down to kind of assess a kid, we have this sheet, and I'm happy to send this to anybody who's interested. So we've broken it down. Here are the developmental domains here. And then we've broken down skills into phases. So each skill has 4 phases in it. And so like phase 1 in self-regulation can modulate physical and emotional state with adult-initiated external support. So basically, you can regulate yourself if you have an adult there with you to kind of initiate that and say, hey, you need to slow down and do stuff like that. And it kind of works its way across. The next one is can modulate physical and emotional state with self-initiated external. So you ask, like, I need some help with this. like as opposed to me telling you need to calm down now. And the next one is, this kid has 3 calming strategies that they have at their disposal that they've learned that now they use to kind of do self-regulation, and they can do that most of the time. And then they kind of go to the 4th phase, which is, you know, the vast majority of the time they're a well-regulated kid. So there's literally nothing within these that says we'll stop doing that. All of these are based on a skill-building process. And the way we develop a treatment plan is, you know, within a program, it would be, I sit down with, you know, if I'm the clinical person, I sit down with a res person, a medical person, and the teacher. And we've seen this kid for now 2 or 3 weeks. And all we've done is highlight which of these we've seen the kid be able to do. So what'll happen is almost no one starts on phase 1 in all 6 domains. Maybe they're in phase 1 in self-regulation and phase 1 in attachment, but they might be in phase 2 or 3 in adaptive living skills, because this kid may have had to take care of himself for a really long time. He may be in phase 2 of cognitive skills. He may be in phase 1 of healthy sexuality. So just like normal development, again, it's not linear. So it all doesn't flow together. Some kids, you know, you get kids on the spectrum who are really good at cognitive skills and, yeah, not so great at social skills, or not, you know, kind of can be regulated most of the time, but only with structure around them, and you change the structure and all of a sudden they've lost it. So it'll vary from kid to kid, but the treatment plan is basically how do we get you to the next phase in each of those developmental domains. Does that make?
It's not age-based.
Yes, it's not age-based. On the other hand, helping parents, and this will go back, I know we're traveling through a lot of these, but this will go back to the kind of engaging parents in treatment. The first part of engaging parents in treatment is providing education for them. One of the things I would say to you is when you are working with families and you first talk to parents, can you explain to them what you're going to do? Like, without knowing tons about the kid, can you talk about this is how we work with trauma? This is how I understand it. These are the sort of difficulties that, you know, people oftentimes go through. I don't know where your kid's at in this particular spectrum, but these are the things we look at, that they struggle with relationships, that they have a hard time, you know, regulating themselves, that sometimes their learning is impacted and they struggle in school and they get frustrated real easily. So I can talk to them about that and talk to them about the process without knowing literally anything about their kid. And then saying where your kid fits here is going to depend on where they're at developmentally, you know? And one of the things that I'll use in that is this. I actually carry it around with me all the time. This is called the Child Development and Trauma Guide. It is put out by the Victorian government in Australia. It is free. You can download it. In fact, if you Google Child Development and Trauma Guide, it'll be the first or second thing that shows up. And the way this is organized is this. It literally covers development from 0 to 18. So this is like 0 to 12, you know, 1 to 3, 3 to 5. And the way it's organized is this. On the front page, developmental trends. Basically, what are the developmental skills your kid should be learning at that age? Social, emotional, physical, so that's on the front side. On the back, possible indications of trauma for kids at particular developmental stages. Under the possible indications of trauma is the impact of trauma for kids at those developmental stages. And then, what I particularly like about it, parental and caregiver support responses for kids developmentally at those ages. Okay? So one of the things that I do when I sit down with parents, like our kids go from 10 to 22, so most of them fall in this 12 to 18-year-old bit. And so the first thing I'll do with parents is just sit down with them and say, I want to go just through the front part here, forget about the trauma piece. I just want to go through the front part. I want you to tell me what your child can do. So just tell me where your kid's at, you know? And people will go, and sometimes you have to give them examples of what it means and stuff like that. But like, Yeah, they're okay there, they're okay there. Yeah, that's a problem. Yeah, that's always been a problem. Yeah, he's never been able to do that. I didn't even know he was supposed to be doing that. Like, you know, but honestly, parents actually like to do this. They really are happy to go through this with you and tell you, yeah, this is where my kid's at. And then I'll pick where I think the kid is at developmentally, like, let's say 5 to 7 or 3 to 5. And I'll say, I want you to do the same thing here. Tell me what your child can do. And they'll go, yep, he can do that, he can do that. Not so great at that. Yeah, that's the problem. That's the reason why I brought him to you. Like, you know, like they'll kind of go through this. And the interesting thing for me always is then they'll look at the years and they'll go, oh yeah, 5 to 7, that wasn't a good time. I was still drinking then. That's when his dad left. That's when he got abused. I mean, you'll begin to get some sense of, yeah, 5 to 7, that's why. And you go, yeah. And then you go, so from a treatment point of view, this is where we're going to start. Because if the whole idea behind development is if he can't do this, he can't do this, you know? So the other thing it does is it makes, as opposed to me just doing an assessment and then telling you this is what's going on with your kid, it engages the parent in terms of saying, you are the expert on your kid. So you can tell me. And then when we sit down to come up with the treatment plan, the reason why we're starting here is because you told me that's what your kid's struggling with. So it's a way of engaging the parents in the assessment process while you're also doing education with the parents around this is where your child should be at developmentally, and this is where the gaps are. And that's really the whole notion behind the treatment. There are certain foundation skills that we have to have that because kids experience trauma in their early life, they oftentimes missed. And the work becomes identifying where are the gaps in those skills, where are the pieces they missed around self-regulation, around accurately reading social cues, around delaying gratification, around, you know, organizing their problem solving and organizing information. What are the pieces they missed? And then how do we go back without taking the 16-year-old and treating him like he's 3, okay? How do we, I would say the art of doing treatment with these kids is, how do you have one foot in the 16-year-old camp with the understanding that essentially what you're trying to do is backfill the three-year-old stuff. But you can do that if you make treatment about the doing, because part of what you have to think about developmentally is how do little kids learn? They learn by play. They learn by activities. They don't learn by sitting and talking to you for 50 minutes at a clip. And so you look for those ways, and particularly in terms of those early developmental skills, kids have to experience that, not just talk about it. And so if we understand where the developmental gaps are and how this particular kid integrates information and learns and incorporates stuff, then we, you know, that's really the basis of doing treatment with these folks. Ultimately, I would argue that you're doing this. Here's the trauma work. But I would argue the trauma work has to take place within a kind of context and crucible of safety. Sometimes you can't control all the safety things. You can't control the house where the kid's going to live or the neighborhood that they live in or whatever. So you control what you can control. How safe is the therapy session? How safe's the church group? How safe's the youth group? How do you make your office feel safer and more contained? You know, sometimes it's basic stuff. These lights, kids on the autism spectrum, this would drive them crazy, you know? Yeah, yeah, exactly. So you go, okay, I need different lighting in my, you know, in the room, in the office for this kid. Sometimes you have to literally carve out, like sometimes I've taped out in my office their space, and they make that their safe space. And if they need pillows, sometimes they build walls, sometimes they, you know, do all sorts of things in terms of operating, but you're trying to sort of, that's why, you know, there's a a rocking chair or like one of those big exercise balls in there because I want to be able, even when I'm talking to them, to provide movement. I almost never do a whole session sitting down. We're getting up and we're doing something, or we're doing something interactive with one another, or we're doing puzzles. And this is true with families too. Even doing family sessions, you want to get them up and engaged with one another to do stuff, not just talk about stuff. And it doesn't, you don't have to play some elaborate game. We were talking about the attunement piece before. One of the, again, I went to Catholic school, and one of the things you often did in these huge classrooms, particularly by the time you got like the 7th, 8th grade, and there was like some girl in front of it that you liked, that you would like write notes to her on her back, and stuff like this. So sometimes I'll do that with families and say, okay, I just, I'm going to write a letter on your back. I just want you to tell me what the letter is, okay? Oh, I feel very tuned to you right now. So you can just do simple stuff that's like play. But it engages people again. One of the biggest things I do, particularly since I work with a lot of acting out boys, if they're there, particularly with their fathers, one of the things I'll ask them to do is thumb wrestling. Okay? It becomes a really interesting response because, first of all, you've got an oppositional 16, 17-year-old kid in your office, and I'm filling out forms, and I'll say, hey, while I'm doing this, could you guys thumb wrestle? And the kid will go, I told you this was going to be stupid. You just, and my almost universal response to that is, it is only one of the many stupid things I'll ask you to do while you're here. And because it's like the first session, the father will go, thumb wrestle, you know how to thumb wrestle, and like, but you'll get this response like this. Can I just Bart? You'll get, here's this kid who doesn't want to do this, so they're not doing anything. And dad, right, but dad is talking to me. See, this is what I'm talking about. This is the attitude we get all the time. You ask him to do something simple, he won't even do this, blah, blah, blah. And that's right. So then you get that, and then dad will kind of grab, and I've had this happen in my office, you get that, that's fine, and the guy, we're thumb wrestling, and so they're pulling it back. Or the kid will sit there and do nothing, and dad's like, pressing his thumb down, pressing his thumb. See, this is it. And finally the kid does something, and then it becomes like, and I've had this father and son up in the room, and they're like going like this, and then the kid did that little thing where they're kind of baiting you, they kind of hide their thumb down, and they wait. And this dad turns to me and he goes, he's cheating. And he's like screaming. And the kid's like, he's cheating. See what he's doing? He's cheating. And I'm like going, first of all, I don't know if there's an international rule book of thumb wrestling. So I don't know what the official rules of thumb wrestling are. But to me, that doesn't look like cheating. Like, that happens all the time, right? And like literally, you've done a diagnostic in like a minute, because you see this like holding back, and all of a sudden the kid gets to that level like, screw this, and it's either like, I'm ripping my hand away, or now, I'm going to press it down as hard as I can, and it's like, and they've totally forgotten about you. They're just engaged in this conflict now, and it's like, okay, and then you'll get like really cerebral parents who go, oh, so I see what we were doing there. We were showing our conflict stuff. I said, no, I just asked you to do that because I thought it would be fun. But part of what you want to do is look for those opportunities. When parents come in their the two types of families we get are the ones that are enmeshed, like literally they're all sitting in each other's laps when they come, or they're totally disengaged. And the only way they engage each other is through crises. So giving them the opportunity during a session to literally be in touch with one another, like physically be in touch with one another. So the other thing I might do, can I just borrow you for a sec here? This is also an attunement exercise, so all I want you to do, put up your hands, brace yourself, and I want you to push as hard as you can. Just push. Come on, push. So you kind of push like this, and it's interesting. You've done a couple of things here. You're using touch, so you're putting them back, and if they're mad at one another, you'll get this. After a little bit, they'll say, and the rules of this when you're doing it as an attunement exercise is you're not allowed to push the person over, and you can't push them side to side, but you have to get enough tension in your arms where, this is like progressive muscle relaxation. This is tense, And then you go, okay, just shake out those arms a little bit and calm down. But I've done this with a, thank you, with a mom and a son where I asked them to push, and mom did nothing. And this teenage boy, like they're in my office, and the teenage boy is like pushing her back, like 5 steps. And he's like going back like this. And the kid stopped, and he goes, I don't like this. And the reason why they were in is because he was acting out, and he was being oppositional and stuff. And I said, what don't you like? He says, I'm going to push her right into the wall. And mom goes, yeah, I don't like this either. And I said, well, what don't you like about it? And he said, he's going to push me right into the wall. And I said, so what do you want to do? And she said, push back. And I said, okay, go ahead. So then she starts pushing back, and then they start laughing, you know, because he's pushing and mom's, and he's like here, and mom's this tiny, she's like, you know, like this, and he's like, you know, but they're like laughing about it. And it's like putting people literally in touch with and engaged with one another again creates a different dynamic. It's not always positive, but it's a different dynamic. And you're looking to do that piece within the course of treatment. There's a lot more we could talk about, but hopefully it feels like, at least in the kind of broad framework of thinking about treatment, that this was helpful, and maybe you've gotten a few things that you can do. And my email address is on there on the, I think it's on the front slide. It's also on the very last page. If people have questions or they resources you want or stuff like that, feel free to just email me, and I'm happy to share stuff with you.
How do I reference that phrase in the paper that I couldn't read up there?
Oh, the developmental matrix, just,
Developmental matrix?
yes.
Okay.
Or if just said, yeah, send me that treatment thing that I couldn't read, I'll know what you're talking about.
So let's give a round of applause to Kevin Creeden.